It's 1979. Gas lines still haunt America's memory. Detroit is scared, and inside Chevrolet, a quiet decision is being made that almost nobody talks about today. Because this engine wasn't meant to be legendary, it was meant to survive. But instead, it failed before it even had a chance to begin. Most people have no idea the Chevy 267 small block ever existed. And there's a reason for that. Because the 267 wasn't just underpowered, it wasn't just unpopular. It was a symbol of an era when American V8s were being strangled, downsized, and slowly suffocated by rules they weren't built for. And what happened next changed everything for Chevy's small block legacy. You think you know the story of small block Chevys? Not like this. By the late 1970s, the world had turned upside down for American automakers. The oil crisis of 1973 and again in 1979 didn't just raise gas prices, it shattered confidence. Americans who had grown up believing gasoline was cheaper than water suddenly found themselves waiting in lines that stretched around city blocks. Fights broke out at gas stations. Rationing became reality. And the government pointed its finger directly at Detroit. Muscle cars had become political targets. Emissions regulations tightened every year. The Environmental Protection Agency demanded cleaner exhaust. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration pushed for safety. Corporate average fuel economy standards loomed like a guillotine over every boardroom table. Insurance companies punished horsepower with premiums that could bankrupt a young driver. And buyers who once begged for cubic inches were now asking one terrifying question. How many miles per gallon does it get? That question kept Chevrolet executives awake at night, because the answer wasn't good enough. Chevrolet's small block V8 had been the hero of the American road since 1955. The 283, the 327, the mighty 350, engines that made power, made torque, and made noise. These were the engines that won races. These were the engines that built legends. These were the engines that made teenagers fall in love with cars. But suddenly, those same strengths were liabilities. Every cubic inch was a target. Every horsepower was a liability. Every V8 was a symbol of everything wrong with American excess. So Chevy did something it had never done before. It went smaller. Much smaller. In 1979, Chevrolet introduced the 267 cubic inch small block V8. On paper, it sounded logical. Less displacement meant better fuel economy. Less power meant lower emissions. Less stress meant longer engine life. Marketing could sell it as the responsible choice. Accountants could point to compliance numbers. Engineers could check boxes on government forms. At least, that was the theory. Reality would prove far more complicated. The 267 shared the same basic architecture as every other small block Chevy. Same external dimensions, same bore spacing, same cast iron block that had proven itself across millions of miles, same firing order, same bell housing pattern, same accessory mounting points. To the untrained eye, it looked identical to its legendary siblings. But internally, it was radically different. The bore was just 350 inches. The stroke was 348 inches. That gave it a displacement of exactly 267 cubic inches, or 4.4 liters. For comparison, the classic 350 ran a 4.4-inch bore with the same 3.48-inch stroke. Chevy hadn't shortened the crank. They hadn't redesigned the rotating assembly, they simply shrank the cylinders. And that decision would haunt the engine from day one. Think about what they were doing. They took a proven engine architecture and tried to make it something it was never designed to be. The small block Chevy was born to make power. It was designed with room to breathe. It was engineered for expansion, not contraction. And now they were asking it to become small and efficient. It was like asking a linebacker to become a gymnast. Compression ratio was a low 8.31. That wasn't conservative. That was suffocating. In an era when emissions equipment already strangled performance, the 267 started from an even weaker position. Horsepower ratings reflected it. The early 267 made just 115 horsepower. Later versions barely reached 125. Torque hovered around 215 lb-ft on a good day. Let that sink in. This was a V8. With less power than some four-cylinders today. With less torque than economy cars would make decades later. With a displacement that seemed pointless when you looked at the numbers. And it got worse. Because power wasn't the only thing sacrificed. Breathing was crippled from the factory. The 267 used tiny valves, 1.72-inch intake valves, and 1.50-inch exhaust valves, much smaller than other small blocks in the lineup. These were the same valve sizes used in smaller Chevrolet engines. But here's the critical problem. The cylinder bores were so small that Chevy physically couldn't fit larger valves without shrouding them against the cylinder walls. Airflow was restricted before the engine even fired. The combustion chamber design was compromised. The valve angles couldn't be optimized. Everything about the top end was a cascade of compromises forced by that tiny bore diameter. But there was another problem, and Chevy didn't see it coming. By shrinking the bore so dramatically while keeping the same stroke, the 267 ended up with a terrible bore-to-stroke ratio. The pistons moved the same distance as a 350, but through much narrower cylinders. That increased piston speed relative to airflow. The engine wanted to rev, but it couldn't breathe. It wanted torque, but it couldn't fill its cylinders efficiently. At low RPM, there wasn't enough airflow to make torque. At high RPM, the restricted breathing created a ceiling the engine couldn't break through. It was the worst of both worlds. The result was an engine that felt exhausted at 3,500 RPM. An engine that sounded like it was working hard, but going nowhere. An engine that made all the noise of a V8 without any of the reward. Drivers noticed immediately. Throttle response was lazy. Step on the gas and wait. Acceleration was painful. Merge onto a highway and pray. In cars like the Camaro, Malibu, Monte Carlo, and El Camino, the 267 felt like it was dragging an anchor. 0 to 60 times stretched past 13 seconds. Some tests showed even worse numbers. Passing on the highway required planning, patience, and a complete absence of oncoming traffic. And merging? That took faith. You could floor it. The engine would roar, the tachometer would climb, and nothing would happen, just noise and frustration. Car magazines were brutal. Road tests damned the 267 with faint praise at best, outright mockery at worst. Writers who had grown up loving American V8s couldn't understand why Chevrolet had done this to itself. But here's the cruel twist. It didn't even deliver great fuel economy. Most 267 equipped cars barely cracked the low 20s on the highway under ideal conditions. Some struggled to hit 18 mpg in real-world driving. City mileage was even more disappointing. The engine that was supposed to justify its existence through economy couldn't even deliver on that promise. Meanwhile, Chevy's own 305 small block, just 38 cubic inches larger, made more power, more torque, and often returned similar real-world mileage. Sometimes the 305 actually got better economy because it didn't have to work as hard to move the car. So what was the point? This question echoed through dealership service bays, through owner conversations, through letters to car magazines. If the 267 didn't make power and didn't save gas, what exactly was it for? Inside Chevy, engineers were trapped by forces beyond their control. Emissions rules forced lean air-fuel mixtures that killed power. Catalytic converters restricted exhaust flow and generated back pressure. EGR systems diluted the intake charge with inert exhaust gas. Retarded ignition timing killed throttle response and low-end torque. Thermactor air injection systems added complexity without adding performance. The 267 wasn't designed to thrive under these conditions. It was designed to comply, and compliance doesn't sell cars. Mechanics hated it because it was all the complexity of a V8 with none of the capability. Enthusiasts ignored it because there was nothing to get excited about. And tuners outright despised it because every modification revealed the same depressing truth. Here's the real nightmare. The 267 had almost zero performance potential. Those tiny bores meant overboring was nearly impossible. You could safely overbore maybe 0.0020 inches, maybe 0.0030 if you were lucky with a good block. Anything more and cylinder walls risked cracking. There simply wasn't enough material to work with. Larger valves? Forget it. The bores wouldn't accommodate them. High-lift cams? Useless without adequate airflow to match. Aggressive cam timing just moved the weak power band around without actually improving it. Porting the heads barely helped because the bore itself became the choke point. You could have perfect cylinder head flow and the engine still couldn't use it. Even simple upgrades felt pointless. Headers that freed up 20 horsepower on a 350 might find 5 on a 267. Intake manifold swaps that transformed throttle response on other small blocks barely registered. Every dollar spent on modification disappeared into the void of that undersized displacement. One engine builder famously said, "You can spend $1,000 on a 267 and still lose to a stock 305. And he wasn't wrong. It became a running joke in the performance community. The 267 was what you removed from a car, not what you built around. Meanwhile, Chevy was fighting another war. Ford had its 302 Windsor, an engine that was small but still capable of making real power when asked. Chrysler leaned on the 318, a workhorse that served duty in everything from muscle cars to work trucks. These engines weren't exciting either, but they were proven. They had followings, they had aftermarket support, they had respect. The Chevy 267, by contrast, felt like an experiment that escaped the lab too early, a prototype that should have been scrapped in development. An answer to a question nobody was really asking. Sales reflected that reality. The 267 was only produced from 1979 to 1982, just 4 model years. In that short window, it appeared mostly in California emissions vehicles and base model cars where buyers had no other V8 option. Most customers didn't even know what engine they had. The dealer said V8. The window sticker said V8. That was good enough. They just knew the car felt slow. They just knew something was wrong. And then the complaints started. Cold starts were rough. Engines clattered and stumbled until they warmed up. Carburetors struggled with ultra-lean calibrations designed to meet emissions standards. Engines hesitated off the line like they were thinking about whether to respond. Surging at steady cruise speeds frustrated highway drivers. Owners complained of stalling at traffic lights, not catastrophic failures, but daily frustrations. Death by 1,000 annoyances. Warranty claims piled up. Service bulletins circulated. Mechanics learned to dread seeing a 267 roll into the bay because the problems were always the same and the solutions were always frustrating. And then the real nail in the coffin arrived. Chevy realized something uncomfortable. The 305 had become good enough. With a 3.736-inch bore and the same 3.48-inch stroke, the 305 could breathe. It could accept better heads. It responded to tuning. It made 150 to 170 horsepower, even in emissions trim. It felt like a real engine. It delivered acceptable acceleration. It merged onto highways without prayers. And crucially, it didn't hurt fuel economy any more than the 267 did in the real world. So why keep the smaller engine? There was no performance advantage, no economy advantage, no packaging advantage, no enthusiast appeal, no dealer demand. The 267 existed in a no-man's land between viability and obsolescence. By 1982, Chevrolet quietly pulled the plug. No farewell announcement, no press release explaining the decision, no legacy edition with special badges. The tooling was repurposed for engines that actually sold. The production lines moved on. The engine vanished from order sheets, and almost overnight, the 267 became invisible. Owners replaced them without sentiment. Junkyards stacked them without concern. Rebuilders ignored them without regret. The 267 disappeared not with a bang, but with the quiet whisper of irrelevance. But its failure mattered, because the 267 taught Chevy a brutal lesson. You can't save an engine by shrinking it to death. You can't engineer your way to compliance by removing capability. You can't ask customers to accept less while paying the same. What Chevy needed wasn't less displacement. It needed smarter engineering, better combustion chambers that could squeeze more power from less fuel, fuel injection that could precisely meter air and fuel for any condition, computer-controlled ignition that could optimize timing moment by moment, overdrive transmissions that could keep engines in their efficiency sweet spots, real solutions to real problems. And that's exactly what came next. By the mid-1980s, throttle body injection revived drivability across the small block lineup. Roller cams reduced friction and freed up power. Computer management systems learned to balance emissions with performance. By the 1990s, the LT1 arrived and reminded America what a Chevrolet V8 was supposed to feel like. Then, the LS rewrote the rulebook entirely, becoming one of the most celebrated engine families in automotive history. The small block survived. It thrived. It became legendary again. But the 267 didn't. Today, almost nobody restores a 267. Performance parts are scarce because nobody makes them. Rebuild kits are limited because demand doesn't justify production. Many owners swap them out entirely for 305s or 350s without a second thought, without sentiment, without any desire to preserve what was there. And that's the final irony. The Chevy 267 wasn't a bad engine because it was unreliable. It wasn't bad because it exploded or left owners stranded. It failed because it stood for compromise. It was born in fear, designed to comply, not to excite, engineered to meet minimums, not to exceed expectations, and released into a market that still wanted soul, even in hard times, especially in hard times. So here's the real takeaway. The 267 didn't fail because it was too small. Plenty of small engines have become legends. It failed because it forgot what made the small block Chevy great in the first place. Power you could feel, torque you could trust, and an engine that made you want to drive. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Chevy's most forgotten mistakes, drop a comment and tell me which engine story you want next. Another failure? Another rivalry? Or another hidden chapter of automotive history? And make sure you're subscribed, because the next story goes even deeper.